Good afternoon, and welcome to Case Western Reserve University, Center for Policy Studies, a Louise Briskin lecture on global currents. And our speaker today is Associate Professor Alexander Thompson of Ohio State University. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Thompson to campus because he is a specialist in both international institutions and issues such as global climate change, which he's going to talk about today. Professor Thompson is the author of Channels of Power, the UN Security Council, and U.S. Statecraft in Iraq. He is, and of a series of other articles about the performance of international organizations, the independence of international organizations, and essentially how the international system works now in this sort of bizarre combination of states and international organizations that try to coordinate, and international organizations that have states as members, and international organizations that don't have states as members, and all that kind of thing. So it's really at the cutting edge of the way that the study of international relations is developing. One of the issues that particularly challenges the form of international organization is, well, all environmental issues, but particularly climate change, because this is not something that can be managed at a national level, but it requires changes in behavior at a national level, and we don't really have any way of doing that. It is hard enough to get any particular government to change the behavior of its own people, but somehow getting governments to collaborate on changing behavior across borders is particularly difficult. And of course, all you have to do is live in, say, northeastern Canada to understand that environmental problems do not simply stay within borders as the acid rain falls on you from Ohio, or even things like ducks. The ducks you shoot in Louisiana started out somewhere in Canada, and if they ingested the wrong kind of stuff in Canada, that'll be in the in the ducks you shoot in Louisiana. So environmental issues in general are a real challenge to any way of thinking about international organization, and pose real problems in terms of how we're going to cope with them as a world. And climate change has been one of the premier issues where people have addressed that, or tried to address that. And so it's very, very helpful that someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about international organizations and international cooperation is applying his expertise to this important environmental problem, and that's why I'm very excited to hear from Professor Thompson. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the great introduction, Joe, and thanks a lot for the invitation to be here, and thanks to all of you for coming. As you can see, the title of the talk is The Evolution of the Global Climate Regime, Hard Law versus Soft Law, and I'll talk about what some of those concepts mean in a moment. So we're at a crossroads in the global climate regime, and by regime I'm referring to the UN-based international institutions that have been created to deal with climate change over the last 20 years or so. And we're really at the beginning of a third phase. The first phase was marked by the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second phase began with the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which was a protocol to the Framework Convention. And now we're trying to figure out what the third phase is going to look like. The key parts of the Kyoto Protocol expire this year. So there's been a scramble over the last few years to figure out what the future of the regime would look like after Kyoto, the post-Kyoto future of the climate regime, as it's often referred to. In 2009, there was a major UN-sponsored conference in Copenhagen on climate. This was the 15th Conference of the Parties. So every year, all the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change meet and try to make progress towards new rules, or to agree on new rules related to climate change. And Copenhagen there was a lot of build-up to Copenhagen in 2009. And the stakes, it's really not an exaggeration to say that the stakes at Copenhagen were the future of the regime. There were two parallel tracks of preparatory work going into the conference. One was trying to come up with a new round of commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol had binding commitments for Annex 1 countries, which refers to the industrialized countries. So Kyoto has binding commitments that require Annex 1 countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by a certain amount. So one goal of Copenhagen and one track of the negotiations was to come up with a second round of commitments, because the first round ends, well, from their perspective, was going to end in 2012. Okay, so that was one of the major goals, post-2012 emissions reduction commitments. The second track of the negotiations was to negotiate either a parallel agreement to Kyoto or a brand new agreement, thinking much more broadly than just emissions reduction commitments. Really everything was on the table going into Copenhagen. The preparatory work began as early as 2007, so 2 years, and then at Copenhagen itself you had 2 weeks of negotiations, ending with heads of state coming together for final negotiations to try to get a breakthrough. Here's a picture of Merkel and Sarkozy and Obama and Gordon Brown of the UK on the last night trying to hammer out a deal. So there was a lot of build-up, heads of state showing up at the end, which is fairly unusual. The outcome was a 2-page agreement, well, 2.5 pages if you want to be generous, referred to as the Copenhagen Accord. The Copenhagen Accord basically, in that document, the states that were there decided to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Now this is a collective commitment to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, and collective commitments are fairly meaningless in international law because you can't hold any one state accountable for a collective commitment. The major, or the most important achievement of Copenhagen was an agreement by the rich countries to transfer a lot more money and technology to the developing world, including the establishment of a green climate fund that would channel aid for both climate mitigation, reducing emissions, and climate adaptation, trying to improve the resilience of societies to climate change. So this was an important achievement. Copenhagen also envisions pledges from the countries that signed the agreement. But these pledges were not inscribed in Copenhagen itself. The idea was that they would be determined on a national basis and submitted to the UN afterwards and compiled in a list, basically. So they'd be decided on a national basis, sort of a bottom-up process, rather than what was envisioned going into the conference, which was to actually hammer out these new emissions reduction pledges at Copenhagen. But that never happened. And I should clarify that for the industrialized countries, what I referred to earlier as the Annex 1 countries, the idea was that these pledges, which were referred to as targets, would at some point be binding, whereas for developing countries, they would be referred to as actions, and there was no notion that they would become binding. So I'm using the term pledges to encompass both the targets and the actions. So an important point to know about Copenhagen is that in the end, there were no specific commitments agreed to. And the agreement itself, the Copenhagen Accord, is not binding. The delegates at the conference voted to take note of it. They could not muster the level of agreement to formally adopt it. So they merely took note of the accord. These are literally the third and fourth pages of the Copenhagen Accord were blank tables. I'm not sure why they went ahead and included these as the annexes, because it sort of highlighted failure of the conference, but if you download it on the website, there they are. Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. Appendix 1 is for the industrialized countries, and Appendix 2 is for developing countries. But in Copenhagen's defense, these pledges have been trickling in, and these tables have been filling up. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But again, they weren't negotiated multilaterally. They've just been decided on a national basis and submitted subsequently. So Copenhagen assessments, well, they were generally negative. Greenpeace said on the last night when it was clear that, well, when the Copenhagen Accord was released to the public, Greenpeace said the city of Copenhagen is a crime scene tonight. And the Swedish environment minister, who is representing the EU at the conference, referred to the summit as a disaster and a great failure. But interestingly, for my purposes, a lot of the criticisms focused on the nature of the agreement, not the substantive nature of the agreement, but the fact that it wasn't binding. There were no new binding commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so Gordon Brown, the UK Prime Minister, says, I know what we really need is a legally binding treaty as quickly as possible. He's saying that Copenhagen is not what we need something that's legally binding. The World Wildlife Federation says the Copenhagen Accord is far from the fair, ambitious, and binding deal the world needs. So the bottom line here is that the criticism of Copenhagen was driven partly by the form of the outcome rather than the substance of the outcome. The fact that it did not result in a new hard law treaty. And the implicit and sometimes explicit comparison here was to the Kyoto Protocol, which was the state of the art at the time, which did have binding emissions reduction commitments. So these reactions to Copenhagen reflect what I see as a bias in favor of hard law approaches to global governance problems. According to this view, agreement should contain specific, rigid, and binding obligations, preferably negotiated multilaterally. And I think you saw from some of the quotations on the previous slide that a lot of policymakers and certainly activists prefer these hard law solutions over softer alternatives. And I also think there's a bias among lawyers, both academic lawyers and practicing lawyers. And of course, a lot of the negotiators and policymakers at lower levels of government in this context are lawyers of one sort or another. I think what's driving this is a desire to have international law look as much like domestic law as possible. And certainly many of the most prominent and successful international agreements are in the form of hard law treaties. So if we think of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or the agreements behind the World Trade Organization or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, these are all hard law treaties. And I think we tend to think of that as the standard or sort of the ultimate form of international law. So a quick preview of my arguments. One is that this emphasis on hard law is often counterproductive. In particular, that the benefits of hard law tend to be overstated and the downsides tend to be understated. And I'll talk about Kyoto as an example of this. I will also argue that the move towards soft law that we've seen over the last few years in the climate regime can be explained in efficiency terms. And what I mean by this is it's not just the result of failed negotiations, it's an outcome that is, in a sense, a rational one. And I'll come back to this and explain what I mean. The specific rationale behind this argument is that two critical features of climate change as an issue that requires global governance at the international level are the pervasive uncertainty that accompanies the climate change problem, and the fact that there's a lot of heterogeneity across actors, across countries, in terms of what their interests are vis-a-vis climate change. And when you have a lot of uncertainty and a lot of heterogeneity, soft law solutions are often a more rational approach to dealing with the problem. So the foreseeable future of the climate regime will be generally soft and more decentralized than perhaps what we're used to, and this is okay. I'm sure many of you will challenge me on these arguments, and I welcome that, but I'm going to be provocative for the sake of discussion. So here's what the academic literature, and this is literature in international relations, which is my field, and international law. Here's what the literature has to say about hard law versus soft law. So soft law allows you to make more flexible commitments. Okay, so your commitment can be adjusted or abandoned over time if circumstances change. And if you think about an analogy to a contract, it could be very similar. We might want a flexible contract that can change as circumstances change. Hard law, on the other hand, focuses more on rigid and presumably more credible commitments. Okay? The actor's hands are tied more under hard law than they are under soft law. We generally expect that soft law should lead to higher rates of participation. Actors signing on to an agreement or a contract are less wary of it if it's more flexible, if it's softer or more informal. On the other hand, we generally think that with a hard law agreement, we could get deeper cooperation, more meaningful changes in behavior. Again, partly because the actor's hands are tied. So what we get here is a depth-breadth trade-off, where with soft law we expect wider participation, more actors are willing to sign on. But for hard law, we expect that participation to be narrower but deeper. So states should be going further in their commitments under hard law. Furthermore, and pardon a little bit more jargon, but one advantage of soft law, according to the theoretical literature, is that you have lower costs up front, okay? Lower bargaining costs. So if Jessica Green and I are going to try to come up with an agreement, and we know that it's going to be rigid and binding and last forever, we're going to really take a long time to work out all the details, okay? Whereas if we're going to have something more flexible that we can both back out of or we can adjust down the road, we're going to spend a lot less time negotiating it up front because we're less worried about the consequences down the road. So in theory, soft law has lower costs up front. Hard law takes longer to get going, but once you set it up, in theory, the ongoing costs should be lower. Often hard law involves creating new institutions or delegating power to new institutions, for example, maybe a monitoring body or a dispute settlement body. These can resolve disputes. These can fill in rules that are unclear or when there are gaps in the rules. And so what the theoretical literature tells us is that you can save time on an ongoing basis by choosing the hard law option. And here are a couple examples from the climate regime, or the two most important treaties we've had so far in climate. And the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992 is a great example of a soft law agreement. It has general obligations, but no specific commitments that it imposes on states. And the Kyoto Protocol is sort of the apex of legalization in the global climate regime. It's the only agreement at the global level with explicit binding commitments in climate change, and these are combined with a substantial set of implementation and monitoring procedures and institutions. Okay, so this is what the theory tells us. Kyoto is the quintessential hard law agreement and the most legalized agreement in the area of climate change. So let's assess Kyoto based on what the theory tells us. And so my argument is that you do see, if we think of this as trade-offs between soft law and hard law, you do see the downsides of hard law, but you don't see all of the upsides that the theory tells us we should see. So let me tell you why I make that argument. So the first problem, which is the one we would expect from hard law, is limited participation. And indeed, that's exactly what we see with the Kyoto Protocol. That countries were very worried about signing on to an agreement that would tie their hands. And especially, as Joe White noted, with climate change, you have to make changes at the domestic level. So this makes it different than other areas of international law. Consider an arms control agreement. Well, once the two governments agree, it's the governments themselves, it's the executive branch that's going to be carrying out the agreement. Whereas with climate change, you need to make substantial changes at the domestic level. This has governments very worried about what the implications of a binding commitment are going to be down the road. And I have a quotation here from the Indian Environment Minister. India cannot agree to a legally binding agreement for emissions reductions at this stage of our development. And so these concerns were especially strong for developing countries. And basically developing countries announced at the very beginning of the climate regime, there's no way we're going to sign on to any international agreement that ties our hands in terms of how we can promote economic growth and develop. One result of this is that Kyoto only had commitments for these 38 industrialized countries. So you're immediately ruling out participation by the entire developing world by choosing the hard law approach of the Kyoto Protocol. Another feature of hard law, a hard law treaty, a formal treaty, is that it has to be ratified at the domestic level. So in the US, for example, we require a two-thirds vote in the Senate to ratify a treaty. On the other hand, a soft law agreement or an informal agreement between countries does not face this ratification hurdle. And so the ratification ends up being really consequential in the case of Kyoto. So while the agreement was signed in 1997, the ratifications were very slow in coming, and the agreement could not enter into force until 55 countries had ratified. And this didn't occur until 2005. So you had this period of 8 years where the agreement existed in this sort of legal limbo, where a lot of countries had signed it, but not enough countries had ratified for it to enter into force. So this is sort of limited participation in a different sense. It's sort of delayed participation. The United States, famously, the Senate passed Byrd-Hagel in 1996, I want to say. Maybe it was 1997. Basically announcing before Kyoto was even signed that they would not ratify a treaty that looked like what Kyoto ended up looking like. As John Kerry said at the time, what we have here is not ratifiable in the Senate. And just to give another example, in Canada, oil was opposed, big business was opposed, a lot of the western provinces were opposed to ratification, and so Canada didn't ratify until 2002. Ratification also poses all sorts of strategic issues. For example, in Australia, the Business Council of Australia, along with the coal, steel, and aluminum lobbies, insisted that Prime Minister Howard not even consider ratification until the US had ratified. So one logic for not ratifying is because others haven't ratified, which makes it even more complicated, an additional complication of hard international law. On the other hand, there was no real upside of Kyoto in terms of compliance and serious action on climate change. So it would be one thing, remember the depth-breadth trade-off, it would be one thing if we limited participation, but for those countries that did participate, they were engaging in very meaningful participation. But Kyoto somehow manages to defy the traditional depth-breadth trade-off. And you sort of get the worst of both worlds, relatively few countries signing on to targets that aren't especially deep to begin with, and then in many cases subsequently not complying. Now we don't know exactly what the compliance record is going to look like because countries have until the end of this year. So on this point about participation, just to make it more explicit, these are the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. This is by country, though I threw in the European Union in there for sake of comparison. So the EU would be number 3. So this is the dirty dozen responsible for 80% of global emissions of greenhouse gases. And these countries had no Kyoto commitments. In the case of Brazil, India, and China, it's because they were developing countries and no developing country has a commitment. In the case of the United States, it's because the US never ratified. So you basically have almost half of global emissions that aren't even covered by the Kyoto Protocol because of this lack of participation. And keep in mind that some of the other countries on this graph that did indeed ratify took years to do so. So they're only bound by Kyoto very late in the game. So Japan and Canada, I already mentioned, didn't ratify until 2002. Russia didn't ratify until 2004, and Australia didn't ratify until 2007. So I'm counting those countries on this graph as having participated, but in many cases there was a long delay. The most recent, well, I should say that the main fear for these countries was that they didn't want to sign up to a hard target and a deadline, which made their participation politically and economically risky. So the hard law aspect of Kyoto deterred participation. The latest climate talks, which were in Durban in December of 2011, kept open the possibility of a new round of commitments under Kyoto, but it was also the occasion for 3 countries to formally withdraw from Kyoto, Canada, Russia, and Japan. So it was sort of like a step forward, but then a step backward as well. So in fact, overall, Kyoto today covers only about 15% of global emissions. This is a table that shows for some of the Annex 1 countries, it shows what their target was in Kyoto. And this is a target relative to a 1990 baseline. So in some cases, you'll see the target is above 0, but that's because it's relative to a 1990 baseline, and the agreement was reached in 1997. So, and the targets for for the European countries, Europe agreed as a group to limit their emissions to 8% below 1990 levels, and then within the EU, they agreed on a distribution of those targets across the EU countries. So some of so these European targets are ones agreed to within the EU, but as part of an effort as a group to meet a single Kyoto target. Anyway, the point is, and I stopped in 2007 because things changed after the global recession. A lot of countries' emissions went down just because their economy stalled, and in some senses it's not fair to give them credit for that, for not doing anything, but having a lame economy. So, I mean, the picture is mixed here. It's not a disaster for every country, but if you look at Canada, for example, it's not a very pretty picture, and if you look at Spain, it's not a very pretty picture. If you look at Japan, Japan doesn't seem to be on its way to compliance either. In some cases, the UK is an example. Some countries have done a good job reducing their emissions, but have done so with quick fixes or one-time fixes. So maybe you're switching from coal to natural gas, or coal and oil to natural gas. That's going to bring your emissions down, but it's not clear if it's just a one-time adjustment, sort of picking some low-hanging fruit. It's not clear that these countries are going to be able to sustain those reductions. Okay, so my first argument about the limits of hard law was in terms of the participation and the fact that it was not necessarily offset by meaningful changes in behavior. My second point is getting back to this jargony term I used before, transaction costs. So remember, in theory, hard law presents higher transaction costs up front. It takes longer to bargain, but it should save you some costs after the fact. But I don't really see that in the climate case. And in fact, I would argue that transaction costs can increase with harder law or with legalization. To begin with, if you have a specific and binding obligations, you need a much higher level of accountability. You need much stricter monitoring, for example, because you have to figure out whether these countries are actually adhering to their specific binding commitments. So one way to meet your commitment under Kyoto is by enhancing carbon sinks. And the most common way to do that is through your forestry practices. Well, imagine having to monitor every forest all around the world in terms of how large they are and how much carbon they're soaking up. This is an incredibly difficult task. And you should see the lengthy reports and articles that have been written on trying to come up with monitoring technologies that can be used across time and space and that are reliable and cheap. It's very difficult. Also, with greater legalization, you tend to get the creation of new institutions and delegation to new institutions. And this leads to all sorts of new costs, because you have to agree on creating these, and then you have to oversee these new institutions, what I call here oversight costs. Okay, so an example of this in the context of Kyoto is the Clean Development Mechanism. So the Clean Development Mechanism is a part of Kyoto that allows industrialized countries to get credit for reducing emissions by investing in projects in the developing world. So the idea here is that it's one atmosphere, it's one climate, so it doesn't matter where the emissions reductions are coming from. And if I can get more bang for my buck investing $1 million in a clean energy project in the developing world, I should be encouraged to go ahead and do that. If I'm a Canadian company, invest in a Brazilian energy plant, and you get a lot more reductions, and you get credit for it than if you did at home in Canada. Well, that sounds like a great idea in practice, but all of these reductions have to be verified, which requires establishing a baseline for what the emissions would have been. It requires a methodology for counting up how much you reduced emissions by. It's incredibly complicated, and of course these are projects going on around the world. And it turns out that this requires a lot of capacity on the part of the governments that are participating. And for a lot of smaller countries and poorer countries, it's very difficult for them to participate in the Clean Development Mechanism. The Clean Development Mechanism methodology booklet, when it was first created, it had the feel of a booklet, the Latin suffix meaning small. Today, this is printed out four pages to a sheet and two-sided. The CDM methodology booklet is now 200 pages long, and that's just the basic methodology for the CDM. It gets even a lot more complicated than that. And so in the context of the CDM, you also get this phenomenon I mentioned earlier of this proliferation of new institutions, and every time you get a new institution, you create this, you're delegating authority to some new body, and then you have to oversee that body. And in political science, we sometimes refer to this as a principal-agent relationship. So all these new institutions, all these new relationships, and in every case you have to monitor these new institutions. So this is just a quick sketching. I haven't even put all of the institutions and actors involved, but this is the Clean Development Mechanism. And I won't go into too much detail, but it starts at the top with the Conference of the Parties that I mentioned earlier. So that's just all the states that meet to sort of run the climate regime. And they have delegated to the Clean Development Mechanism Executive Board, okay, which is basically a subset of states, and they have a secretariat that they work with. They in turn work with designated operational entities, which are private companies that certify projects. And they have to work with the designated national authority, which is a government bureaucracy in the country where the project is being implemented. And then you have the actual project developer itself, which is usually a private company engaging in some emissions reduction activity. So without going into too much detail, I'll give you a quotation from a prominent climate change scholar who's sitting in the room, Jessica Green. And she is looking at the relationship between the executive board and these designated operational entities, and concludes that we can't be assured that these private agents are not pursuing their own goals at the cost of those delegating to them. That's just one relationship, okay? You have other problems with all of these other relationships. So this contributes to my argument that you're actually increasing these costs with greater legalization. This just is meant to illustrate that the credits that are being issued under the Clean Development Mechanism are overwhelmingly going to only a handful of countries. So you can see more than 3/4 going to China, Brazil, India, and South Korea. And this really comes back to the capacity issues I was mentioning before. A lot of least developed countries can't even engage because it simply requires too much capacity and expertise. One developing country government that participated, one delegate that participated in Copenhagen, pointed out that at one point during the Copenhagen meeting, there were 26 meetings going on simultaneously, and the delegation from his country consisted of 2 people. So you can, it's not hard to imagine that it would be hard to fully participate in the climate regime as it stands today. What would an alternative look like to hard law in the climate regime? Well, first I want to point out that I think climate change has three defining features as sort of a global cooperation problem. The first one is that it is the mother of all public goods. And as we know with public goods, you often have the problem of free riding. You have this collective action problem. No one wants to be the one person to contribute to the public good. Everyone hopes that they can sit back while others contribute. And I think this aspect of climate change has received so much attention. It has been overwhelmingly the focus of policy literature and academic literature on climate change. And I think it is this problem, that climate change is a public good and has these properties of a public good, that has led to hard law, a search for hard law solutions. Because the best way to prevent countries from free riding is to tie their hands and have binding commitments. But climate change is characterized by two other very important features as well. One is uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty over the precise impacts of climate change and how severe the problem is going to be overall. There's a lot of uncertainty about different policy alternatives for dealing with climate change. It's still a fairly young issue. So we're not exactly sure what the costs and benefits of different approaches is going to be. And I have a quotation here from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from their 2007 report. In all cases, policy decisions will have to be made with incomplete understanding of the magnitude and timing of climate change, of its likely consequences, and of the costs and benefits of response measures. So you have a high level of uncertainty, and you also have a high level of heterogeneity across countries in terms of their interests. Again, the impacts of climate change are very uneven. Some countries like Russia and Canada may even be net beneficiaries, but we're not sure. And also the costs of reducing emissions, the cost of abatement or mitigation, vary wildly across countries. Some countries are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, others aren't. Some countries have publics that are very open to environmental concerns and are willing to pay for them. Other countries don't. So the costs across countries of approaching the climate change problem are highly variable. And this also gets to the issue of the political constraints on governments. So we can think of these costs in terms of economic costs, but if you think of them in terms of political costs, it's not very politically costly or risky for the German government to really go out on a limb and say they're going to do something aggressive on climate change. The public generally will rally around that. But in the United States, in Australia, Canada, it's a more mixed reaction. Okay, so I only have a few more slides. So in light of this uncertainty and heterogeneity, soft law actually accommodates these problems better, and in particular accommodates two institutional responses, which are to have flexible institutions and more decentralized institutions. There's a significant literature on flexibility or institutional reflexibility as a good response to uncertainty, and it's not surprising. If I don't know what the future holds, I'm going to want a more flexible agreement so I can adjust my obligations over time. And decentralization has also been found to be a good response to heterogeneity. So if actors are very different across space, you're going to want some sort of solution that differentiates among these actors. So there's a literature, for example, on federal countries that are federal systems like the United States, and then the question is, do you want to implement a uniform policy across jurisdictions, or do you want to have a more customized policy across jurisdictions? And basically the answer is, if there's a lot of heterogeneity across jurisdictions, you want a more differentiated policy. If there's less heterogeneity, then you're better off with a uniform policy. And I think a similar argument can be made in the context of climate change. So if you keep in mind those sort of bottom-up commitments under Copenhagen, they're going to be determined on a national basis. You're going to get a lot, so in other words, a decentralized approach. that in some ways that's a better way to accommodate this heterogeneity across countries than to try to impose a top-down solution. Now, when you start combining these, a flexible agreement with a decentralized approach to obligations, then a lot of interesting things can happen. If you have a lot of different approaches going on across space, and if they can be changed over time as circumstances change, what you get are really a lot of different policy experiments, and you can learn a lot from these policy experiments across space and time. So again, if we remind ourselves that climate change is a fairly young issue, there are a lot of benefits to having a variety of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, and then we can derive lessons from these different policy experiments. One problem with Kyoto is that you had a short-term requirement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the only incentive countries had was to pursue policies that could reduce emissions now, which rules out tons of long-term and more creative policies. And so, for example, if you compare the US versus Canada, which is a neat comparison, US had no Kyoto commitment, Canada had a Kyoto commitment, right? So you'd think that if you have a binding commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that you'd get these great, that would stimulate great policy responses. But that didn't really happen. What you had was a lot of resistance on the part of the provinces trying to fend off Ottawa. In the United States, with no top-down requirements coming from Kyoto, you had a lot more creativity and activity across states. And so one study in particular argues that this burgeoning bottom-up process in the US has involved essentially all imaginable options in the kit box of climate policy tools. So for example, we have 28 states with renewable portfolio standards. 23 have committed to regional trading systems of trading carbon of various sorts. In Canada, only Manitoba, Quebec, and British Columbia have efforts that even approach the most active US states. So let's go back to Copenhagen in light of my arguments. So I sort of made fun of Copenhagen in the beginning and showed you a lot of the criticisms. But in fact, these bottom-up pledges could be a good way to accommodate the heterogeneity that we have across actors, and certainly to increase participation. So the U.S. now has has publicly committed to a target. China and India have, for the first time, made pledges to mitigate. They've never done that before in the whole history of the climate regime. So there's an advantage to letting it come from the bottom up. So here's some examples of the pledges that have been submitted. These are for industrialized countries. So you can see there's a lot of variation across countries. Countries are sort of calibrating their pledges according to their circumstances. I can come back to this. There's sort of too much detail to take in. This shows some of the pledges are ranges and some are specific targets. So the wider bars are these ranges. But what I want to point you to here is basically that China and India, these might not be very stringent pledges, but it's very important to have them involved, especially since China is now the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So you can see these pledges that have come in. You can see how much variation there is across countries in the pledges. Also, under Copenhagen, we have a more flexible approach to mitigation policy. There were discussions about how to incorporate more sectors, forestry, for example, how to get away from having to count emissions reductions from every individual project and instead having sector-wide or program-wide. So remember, before I said under Kyoto, you needed to get those reductions right away before 2012, or they basically didn't count. But now there's more discussion of, well, what if a country implements some new renewable energy program, say for appliances? Well, those reductions might not come for a long time. People are going to have to buy the new refrigerators. So maybe countries should be getting credit for things that will have a payoff way down the road. So there's a lot more openness to a wider range of approaches. 82 countries now have submitted either targets or actions under the new Copenhagen system. So this is a nice change in terms of participation from Kyoto. There's still a role for some of the centralized institutions involved in the climate regime, so I don't want to give the impression that we can just decentralize everything and let all of everything come from the bottom up. We still need information provision, and it's nice for that to come from some of these UN institutions that have been created. We need someone to facilitate carbon trading, to set standards. I think one real advantage of Kyoto and the Kyoto process is that it set a lot of standards that have now been multiplied. So every time there's a regional effort to deal with climate change, a national effort, even private actors who are trying to set standards for climate change are often simply adopting the standards from Kyoto. And that's going to lead to a lot of efficiencies down the road once all these efforts get plugged back into each other and want to interface with each other. And I think one thing to remember with climate change is that compliance is not likely to come from, we don't have a global government, right? So we don't have sort of a world agency for climate change that can regulate and impose penalties. So punishments for not complying normally would have to come from other countries, okay? But are countries really going to punish each other for not meeting climate commitments? Probably not. So I think the most important incentive for compliance and climate change is probably going to come from domestic politics and pressure from at the domestic level. So I think what this means is that the softer approach could be just as viable, because again, we don't necessarily need this sort of strict monitoring and enforcement to make it work. It's really just a matter of political will at the domestic level. So this is Julian Assange of WikiLeaks fame. And this is a WikiLeaks cable right after Copenhagen, which I thought was really interesting. So going into Copenhagen, the French were right out in front arguing for a binding approach to climate change. Okay? They didn't get it, mostly because China didn't want to do that. It turned out the US didn't really want to do that either. So afterwards, here's a cable, and this is the US diplomat having met with the French environment minister after Copenhagen is now reporting back to Washington. And what he's reporting back is that the French have basically said that the key to moving forward in the climate regime is to drop the notion of a legally binding treaty in favor of a system of national commitments. In other words, a more bottom-up approach. Bourlou, the environment minister, argued that the key to implementing the equilibrium revealed at Copenhagen was an arrangement that would be voluntary. So he's referring to Copenhagen as sort of an equilibrium. This looks much more like the natural state of what countries can agree on than the Kyoto Protocol, and that a voluntary or soft law approach would be more viable moving forward than a hard law approach. I won't go through this in detail because it more or less just summarizes what I said. But I think we should be open to soft law. It can and should play an important role in the climate regime, in particular because it accommodates these problems of uncertainty and heterogeneity. One possibility is that a little bit of legalization is good, but if it's pushed too far, it starts to backfire or have these downsides that I talked about. And we should keep in mind when we look at international institutions that they're constantly evolving over time. So what I see in the climate regime is sort of a groping towards what that institutional equilibrium should be. We started soft, we went hard, maybe a little bit too far, and now we're kind of coming back to hopefully the sweet spot somewhere in the middle. Thanks for your listening, and thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. That's precisely the kind of talk one wants to hear, one that will challenge people, tell them things they might not necessarily believe, back it up, and leave us with lots to talk about. What we're going to do now is have questions, and I guess what we'd like to do is record the questions so people will know what the question was that he's answering, and so we'll pass around the microphone and go from there.
Okay. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. So I have a couple of questions. Well, one is maybe a little bit more sort of delving into the literature, and so maybe we can table this for later, which is is this to what extent is this a rational response to the problems you've described? And to what extent is it simply learning, right, that we went about it the wrong way? Because we applied basically the sort of standard model of treaty making in environmental governance to a problem that is perhaps a little bit more complex. So that's the first question. And the second question is kind of related, which is most environmental problems are characterized by a fair amount of uncertainty and a fair amount of preference heterogeneity, particularly the global ones. So I am wondering sort of if you can say a little bit more about the extent to which you think this model might apply to other problems.
Okay, great, thanks. So is it a rational response or is it learning? And my answer is yes. That I think it's both, and I think that's exactly what a rational response would be to see what you've done, see what you've now learned about the effectiveness of that response or the consequences of that initial policy response, and then to adjust your response over time. Now, it might raise the question of whether the initial policy you're responding to was rational or whether it was just done with limited information. That I think would be an empirical question. I made a reference in the talk to this literature on adaptive management. And what the literature on adaptive management calls for is, and I would consider it sort of a rational approach, is to look to see what policies you've implemented, which ones are working, which ones are not working, and then you adapt your policy response. And you do that progressively, right? And you get closer and closer to whatever the ideal policy would be. Presumably you never get there, but you're sort of learning over time and adjusting your policies over time. And in some ways, Kyoto was designed with a lot of this in mind. Kyoto has envisioned 5-year commitment periods, successive 5-year commitment periods. So countries initially signed up to a commitment period from 2008 to 2012. And the whole point was that you then negotiate a second commitment period. This was one of the things that was supposed to happen at Copenhagen but didn't. And I think that's precisely because they realized there was a lot of uncertainty and that they'd want to adjust their commitments over time, both as political will changed, but also as their understanding of the problem and of different policy responses changed. So the other question was whether these problems of uncertainty and preference heterogeneity, do these basically exist across all environmental? Is this basically a feature of environmental problems at the global level? Is there anything special about climate change? I think on I think on both counts, I would say that both these problems presumably exist, but that they're worse in climate change than almost any other problem I can talk about. I can think of. So one thing about climate is it's not that useful to even think of it as an environmental problem, because it's largely an economic problem. It affects so many sectors across an economy, right? It can affect transportation, energy production, manufacturing, agriculture, forestry. I mean, I could go on and on. I mean, these are the number of sectors implicated by climate change policy are incredibly diverse. And I think that does have the effect of creating more heterogeneity and interest across actors. There are a lot of environmental problems where it's pretty clear right away that industrialized countries are going to have different interests than developing countries. And you sometimes see this principle of common but differentiated responsibility in international environmental law, sort of the notion that everyone's responsible for solving the problem, but let's be real, the rich countries should bear more responsibility, so common but differentiated responsibility. And so this is a type of heterogeneity problem that calls for a certain kind of differentiation, which is to basically divide the world into two groups. And by the way, you see this in trade too. Special and differential treatment, where you have one set of trade rules that apply to rich countries and another set that apply to developing countries, keeping in mind that there's this heterogeneity. But I think what's really different in climate change is that the variation is so much greater. And I think the gradations, obviously any issue area, if you looked across countries, you would find heterogeneity. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think that, in this case, the problem is turned up to 11 in sort of spinal tapian terms. And uncertainty, I just think, again, it's so complex, and it's such a new issue. And you remember, in climate change, you have natural variables interacting with human activities and these constant feedback loops. So I would also make the same argument with climate change, that there's something unusual about it that really increases the complexity and therefore the uncertainty of the problem. We'll get a handle on this as time goes on, but I still think it's maybe uniquely marked by uncertainty.
Yeah, so you kind of were getting at what I was thinking about asking, which was, why not just have both? In a sense, the narrative you tell is that you might not have got Copenhagen without Kyoto. And so I was not thinking about adaptive management. I was thinking more like the literature on dispute resolution, where the easy things that you can agree on, that's the hard law. You lock those in, and then you kick the more difficult ones down, and that would be more soft. And so you were kind of mentioning it, though, in differentiating between developed and developing. It would seem that the developed would be ready up front, or not ready, but have better possibilities of locking in hard, which would have... So were you getting at that? I mean, is it possible to envision something that is one process but is different phased aspects of hard and soft?
I think thanks, Pete. I think that's a great point. And I didn't incorporate it into the talk. It makes perfect sense, right? So you could have subsets of states. You could think about it different ways. You could have some aspects of climate change that are governed by hard law and other aspects that are governed by soft law. Or you could have some subsets of states that would sign on to hard law. And of course, that's what you had in Kyoto, where industrialized countries had these binding commitments, and developing countries have what amounted to soft commitments. You should think of hard law and soft law on a continuum. So there's a lot of room in the middle where there's no magical way to categorize it. But I think you're right. And so even now, or even under Kyoto, for example, the commitments that industrialized countries had to mitigation were hard law commitments. But they also, from the very beginnings, even going back to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, they had commitments to channel financing to the developing world for both mitigation and adaptation. And most of those commitments are in very broad terms. So in effect, they boil down to soft law commitments for individual countries. So I think that's actually something I'm looking out for now as the regime moves forward. I suspect we'll be moving in a hard law direction when it comes to mitigation policy, but we'll stay in soft law mode for adaptation policy, which is basically aid requirements for the industrialized world. And that could lead to a very interesting comparison. And in fact, I could imagine an even more tighter comparison, which could be that the aid for mitigation comes in the form of hard law commitments, and the aid for adaptation stays in the form of soft law commitments. I mean, the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, is a way to channel financing and technology to the South, and that's tied up in a hard law, because it's tied up in the Kyoto commitments. So anyway, I think you hit the nail on the head. And so that's just I think that's a more nuanced way to say what, I've been thinking of it in these sort of big clunky categories, but I think you're right on with that.
Thank you. Two questions. The first one is you showed us a table of, I think it was CO2 emission reduction, and then later in the talk you compared Canada and the US, saying that Canada, being a Kyoto sign-on, in fact had problems with the provinces rebelling, whereas the US, not a Kyoto sign-on, had actually a lot of states doing initiatives. That. How would you compare them on that table if you did? That's number one. And number two, it seems, certainly to me from that table, that Germany is full of heroes, quite frankly.
Germany what?
Is full. You didn't use the word heroes, but I would.
Oh, yeah, heroes.
And you mentioned later that, in fact, it is a lot because of the public having a commitment individually. Why don't we make more of that? And be aware that other countries have citizens who are committed to helping with global climate change issues, and then maybe it would be easier for us to do it, because we'd realize that there are people out there who, so I'm sorry to be so long-winded, but there are these two main issues I'd love to know. Did the US or the or the Canadian approach, can you simplify it down to who won in the way of emissions reduction? And number two, how about mobilizing the actions in Germany that seem to have such a dramatic effect?
Right. I'm kicking myself as you're talking. I wish I could have that number for the U.S. to compare to Canada. I, off the top of my head, I would say that the number for the U.S. is comparable, but probably a little worse than the number for Canada in terms of emissions reductions since the 1990 baseline. But that's a pretty brute comparison because a lot of other things are going on. For example, the U.S. economy in the 90s is booming, right? So it's hard to separate. I mean, one reason that the U.S. never ratified, sort of overdetermined, one of many reasons for why the U.S. never ratified is that, this 1990 baseline year didn't work out very well for the United States because as the U.S. economy is booming, emissions are accelerating. And so the distance between actual emissions and that 1990 baseline is growing rapidly, and that wasn't as true for a lot of European countries at the time. So as time went on, our target was getting more and more stringent just because the gap between the 1990 baseline and our actual emissions was growing. You're asking a great question. I thought the U.S. was on this graph, which is why I put it up, but then remember that it's not because it's only Kyoto countries. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I think the point I really wanted to make with that comparison was, again, if we think of this as a long-term problem, what we want is, arguably, one thing we want is variety and creativity in policies. If you think of climate change as a problem that has to be solved over the next 100 years, not just the emissions reductions that we need in the next 5 years, then I think as an investment in long-term success, you do want to see a lot of variety. So that was more my point in comparing the U.S. and Canada. Now, as far as the German public goes, I think that's basically what a lot of NGOs are up to, right? Is trying to sort of create a shift in norms that's more pro-environment or that's more precautionary. Now, in Germany, we should also keep in mind that a lot of the countries that reduced their emissions a lot were countries that were in the best position to reduce emissions. So it's not necessarily that their citizens are nicer or more altruistic. Some of the countries that reduced emissions a lot were already investing in renewable energy for a variety of other reasons, or were in a better position to reduce emissions when Kyoto started, which is, this is related. The sort of environmentalism in a country is related to its subsequent actions on climate change. But it does get, if you looked at, for example, per capita reliance on fossil fuel use, how much energy production is due to coal and oil, if you looked at per capita emissions of greenhouse gases, and you looked at all of those things in 1997 when Kyoto was signed, if you just looked at per capita emissions of greenhouse gases, right at the top, US, Australia, Canada. Not a surprise that the US didn't ratify, Australia took till 2007 to ratify, Canada took until 2002. So there's also self-interest going on here, not just some countries are sort of more altruistic or publicly minded or environmentally friendly, even though I do think that's a factor as well.
Thank you. Excuse me, thank you. I found the talk fascinating, but your more recent pointing out how sui generis this issue is in international affairs is absolutely important. You pointed out, for example, the difficulty when you have a heterogeneous group of actors in bringing about agreement and change. And yet, I can't think of another issue. I can think of another issue that is almost equally heterogeneous. That's the international law of the sea. And yet, you're talking about shipping, you're talking about environment, you're talking about pollution, you're talking about overflight rights, you're talking about undersea rights, you're talking about offshore borders, you're talking about military use of the seas, and on and on and on.
Right.
It took an incredibly long time to reach an agreement, but an agreement was reached. And even the slow states were dragged along by those intently involved, just going ahead and doing it. And it literally, because they were the users on the sea, they managed to bring about change. But the trouble with the issue you're dealing with is that we really don't know a great deal about these issues. There was a long history of the use of the sea.
Right.
And so they had a good idea of, if you did this, this is what would happen. We're not altogether certain of what the outcomes will be in the implementation of any kind of agreements that are arrived at. And I think your use of the concept of soft law and your awareness of the uncertainties involved is really a very important thing to point out. We probably shouldn't be so anxious to arrive, even though if we fail to act, we're going to have trouble too. But nonetheless, you're dealing in a quagmire of complexities that you know very little about.
Okay, great. I really like the comparison to the law of the sea, and I sometimes use that when we often get impatient about the climate regime, and activists and academics and lots of people are, we tend to be very disappointed when these meetings don't produce what we want them to produce, and I too am disappointed when that happens. On the other hand, I think again, that's why I emphasize that we think of this as a 100-year problem to be solved. And if you think about how ambitious the climate regime is, and then we compare it to other equally ambitious projects in international law, and the law of the sea is probably the closest example, or if we look at the global trading regime, and we think about how long these took to develop, right? I mean, the law of the sea, you had centuries of customary law percolating, and then you had multiple law of the sea conventions, and in trade, if you think of post-World War II, I mean, you could go back further, but if you think of the GATT in 1947, I mean, it's 20 years before they're even talking about non-tariff barriers to trade, which seem like the most important barriers to trade now. Here we are only 20 years into the climate regime, and we have a lot of really important and effective institutions dealing with climate change at the international level. So, I mean, I think you could see the glass is half full if you put it in this sort of historical comparison. And in some ways, the amount of progress we've made on climate change is pretty remarkable, given the complexity and the uncertainties. I mean, I like the comparison to the law of the sea. One potential difference is that there aren't as many changes that need to be made at the domestic level under the law of the sea. These are mostly decisions that are being made by governments interfacing with other governments. Now, of course, you do have to regulate things like shipping, but it's not as if there's some, people aren't left and right engaging in deep seabed mining, right? I mean, these are big companies. They need a license from their government, and a lot of the law of the sea issues are government to government. But that's not to say, that might be the closest comparison. Thanks.
I'm somewhat troubled by your statement that there's a 100-year problem to be solved. There is uncertainty, but the computer models are starting to converge, And while we don't know how much the temperature will rise this century, we know it will rise. And while we know that the results are not all the results are not certain, we know it's bad.
Right.
And there are modulations on climate change other than carbon, but we know the driving force behind it, we can't call the carbon back. So while all of these uncertainties provide alibis for those who want to delay, it seems that there's no excuse for governments who wish to look at the data and the science to delay that.
Great. So I would actually, one of my points, I think, which I didn't emphasize, is that the best way to get action in the face of uncertainty is through a softer or more flexible approach. And one of the risks with having this binding or hard law approach is that you deter participation, right? And so if you know you're signing up for something that's going to tie your hands indefinitely, then you're suddenly going to start emphasizing all those uncertainties, right? So this more flexible or adaptive approach is one way to get action even in the face of uncertainty. And we also know plenty of models to show it. I mean, small investments, small changes now, if you want to think of them as investments, small investments in dealing with the problem now are going to make it much cheaper in the long run to deal with the problem, right? So the longer we wait, the more expensive it's going to be to deal with the problem. So if you're worried that addressing climate change now is going to reduce GDP growth by 2%, well, if you wait 50 years, that number is going to look a lot worse. So I completely agree with you, and I actually think one of the virtues of a softer or more flexible approach is that you can get action now, whereas the harder approach tends to deter participation. So, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I didn't mean to. When I say it's a 100-year problem, I'm not saying that we should wait to get started on the problem.
I'd like to sort of elaborate on Professor Dahm's point, and then with maybe a devil's advocate-ish sort of comment, and then raise the broader, what seems to me the broadest issue. The devil's advocate comment is that you seem to be saying, is that there's this old saying that the sort of extremists can make the best the enemy of the good. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that in this case one can make the argument the best isn't very good. Mm-hmm. In other words, what you're saying is, well, the best we can hope for is soft law, but the question that Arnie's raising and that we all have to worry and think about is this good enough? I mean, you can say, well, it may be better than hard law, but it may not look very impressive when you actually think about how quickly it will respond to the problem. And so this sort of, this is the best we can do argument, while it may be true, might in fact be quite discouraging if you think about the overall problem. The broader point I wanted to make is essentially what you said is this is a collective action problem. Mm-hmm. Involving a public good, which is also different from some of the law of the sea questions, although there are public good aspects to law of the sea. And what you're saying is, okay, the sort of default way of dealing with a collective action, with the public good problem, is to coerce, right? And that's what hard law is. It is agreement to coerce everybody into behaving in a certain way. And I guess I'd like you to think about or comment on what the other sort of collective action responses to a public good problem are. Because it seems, because among them are selective material benefits. You pay people off for doing something, which is essentially actually what the sort of bribes to developing countries are, right? This is, you try to get them to cooperate by saying you're not cooperating just to help the environment. You're actually, we're paying you something you know you're getting, okay? And then they talk about expressive benefits or purposive benefits or solidary benefits. And by expressive benefits in the literature, what that means is people sort of feel good acting on it. And by solidary benefits, they mean sort of people want to be part of the club, okay? And it seems to me that your argument in these terms is that coercive approaches, hard law approaches, abandon expressive and purposive benefits. Abandon the approach of making people feel good by they have volunteered, they've been convinced this is the right thing to do. In fact, may even make them resist because somebody's ordering them to do it. And that maybe the soft approach, by keeping the question on the table, by asking, what will you do for this good cause, and so on, maybe in this particular collective good problem, or public good problem, maybe the soft approach leaves more room for people to act out of trying to express the good thing, trying to be, to do the right thing. It's not particularly likely, but that seems to me to be the real structure of the argument, that there's a different kind of, that the hard law approach actually reduces the possibility that people will volunteer to do things. And that the soft law approach gives people sort of, keeps the issue out there. There's the Copenhagen, and there's all, we keep talking about this and saying people should act. And maybe it actually encourages people to act for the ways that in the interest group literature we call expressive or purposive. I'm not sure I want to commit to that argument, but if you're going to use a public goods framework, you have to think about what are the other incentives for contributing to public goods.
Well, I think we should keep in mind that even if it's a soft law commitment, it can still be a public commitment, right? So you essentially publicly, which is what's happening around the world, is that countries are publicly committing to a target. So you can still be held to account by a lot of the same mechanisms. They're just not legal mechanisms, right? But you can still be pressured and shamed and guilted into it. But your point, one of you probably knows who did this study. There's a study of a daycare, I think it was in Israel. Does anyone know? So parents were coming late to pick up their kids, and it was becoming a real problem. The daycare was supposed to close at 6 or something, and the parents were showing up at 5 after and 10 after. Not a lot, but enough so that it was annoying for the staff. So they implemented a new policy where if you came late, you'd be charged, $10 a minute for coming late to pick up your kid. The result was that more parents came late. And I think it's related to what you're saying. Now you don't feel guilty about coming late because you're being penalized and you're going to pay, and you've compensated them for it in effect, right? So it sort of backfired. And I could just barely imagine that in climate change where you say, oh, well, wow, let's feel good about, let's do something about climate change because it's the right thing to do. Whereas if you're doing something because you're being told to do something, otherwise you're going to be punished, then it changes your approach. I have no idea if that's true in the case of climate, but I think it's a provocative thought. But back to your first point, which is, are there other responses besides the sort of coercive response to dealing with a public good? And the interesting thing about climate is we get a real variety. So we get rich countries paying poor countries to try to deal with a problem. So that's an incentive, or that's a different approach. We also get one of the solutions to commons problems is privatization. And in effect, that's what a carbon trading scheme is, right? That's what Kyoto does, is it's a cap and trade system. So now you're basically turning carbon into a commodity and you're trading it. So that's a privatization approach. And that was partly done in the law of the sea by extending exclusive economic zones out 200 miles. You're basically saying, okay, more of the sea is now basically private property. So that should lead to an incentive to manage it. So we get really variety across the board with climate change. Different. We're just, I think, trying different things. I think it's kind of interesting to see the tapestry. Yeah.
All of this talk is about nation states. Where do multinational corporations fit into it? Who play by some of their own rules?
Yeah, good question. There are more and more conflicts now. So for example, a lot of the activities of multinational corporations are regulated by investment treaties between countries. So there's something like 3,000 bilateral investment treaties in the world, and they increasingly include provisions to deal with issues like the environment and labor problems. And free trade agreements increasingly include provisions like that as well. So there are private efforts and Jessica might know more about this than I do, but there are even more informal and private things like codes of conduct or sort of best practices to govern the activities of multinationals. But most of them are governed by, prevailing domestic law or by these investment treaties. Now, one of the questions, there are all sorts of questions are arising. So, for example, who's responsible for emissions that come from multinationals? What if a country, as part of their climate policy, wants to regulate multinationals? What if countries want to take into account how things were produced, whether they were produced in an environmentally friendly way when they determine their trade policies, and that's conflicting with the free trade rules. And so a lot of the stuff with investment agreements and trade agreements, it's still shaking out. And it's especially starting to come to a head in Europe where they have more serious rules. So I think you hit the nail on the head, and that's going to be one of the big interest groups. And a lot of multinationals have real competitiveness concerns, right? I mean, if you're a big company and you have to compete and you're being saddled with climate regulations and your competitors aren't, you're going to be concerned about that. And a lot of these countries that were reluctant to ratify Kyoto is partly because they wanted to make sure, everyone's sort of waiting, well, I want those countries to go along first because we're competing with companies there, and they all wanted to move together. So it's sort of a big coordination problem. If we could all move together, we wouldn't be as concerned. But there's no easy answer. And international law is just trying to sort a lot of this out.
Environmental issues in general are a real challenge to any way of thinking about international organization, and pose real problems in terms of how we're going to cope with them as a world. And climate change has been one of the premier issues where people have addressed that, or tried to address that. And so it's very, very helpful that someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about international organizations and international cooperation is applying his expertise to this important environmental problem, and that's why I'm very excited to hear from Professor Thompson. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the great introduction, Joe, and thanks a lot for the invitation to be here, and thanks to all of you for coming. As you can see, the title of the talk is The Evolution of the Global Climate Regime, Hard Law versus Soft Law, and I'll talk about what some of those concepts mean in a moment. So we're at a crossroads in the global climate regime. And by regime, I'm referring to the UN-based international institutions that have been created to deal with climate change over the last 20 years or so. And we're really at the beginning of a third phase. The first phase was marked by the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second phase began with the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which was a protocol to the Framework Convention. And now we're trying to figure out what the third phase is going to look like. The key parts of the Kyoto Protocol expire this year. So there's been a scramble over the last few years to figure out what the future of the regime would look like after Kyoto, the post-Kyoto future of the climate regime, as it's often referred to. In 2009, there was a major UN-sponsored conference in Copenhagen on climate. This was the 15th Conference of the Parties. So every year, all the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change meet and try to make progress towards new rules or to agree on new rules related to climate change. And Copenhagen, there was a lot of build-up to Copenhagen in 2009. And the stakes, more money and technology to the developing world, including the establishment of a green climate fund that would channel aid for both climate mitigation, reducing emissions, and climate adaptation, trying to improve the resilience of societies to climate change. So this was an important achievement. Copenhagen also envisions pledges from the countries that signed the agreement. But these pledges were not inscribed in Copenhagen itself. The idea was that they would be determined on a national basis and submitted to the UN afterwards and compiled in a list, basically. So they'd be decided on a national basis, sort of a bottom-up process, rather than what was envisioned going into the conference, which was to actually hammer out these new emissions reduction pledges at Copenhagen. But that never happened. And I should clarify that for the industrialized countries, what I referred to earlier as the Annex I countries, the idea was that these pledges, which were referred to as targets, would at some point be binding, whereas for developing countries, they would be referred to as actions, and there was no notion that they would become binding. So I'm using the term pledges to encompass both the targets and the actions. So an important point to know about Copenhagen is that in the end, there were no specific commitments agreed to. And the agreement itself, the Copenhagen Accord, is not binding. The delegates at the conference voted to take note of it. They could not muster the level of agreement to formally adopt it. So they merely took note of the accord. These are literally the third and fourth pages of the Copenhagen Accord were blank tables. I'm not sure why they went ahead and included these as the annexes, because it sort of highlighted the failure of the conference, but if you download it on the website, there they are. Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. Appendix 1 is for the industrialized countries, and Appendix 2 is for developing countries. But in Copenhagen's defense, these pledges have been trickling in, and these tables have been filling up. And I'll talk about that.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Case Western Reserve University, Center for Policy Studies, a Louise Briskin lecture on global currents. And our speaker today is Associate Professor Alexander Thompson of Ohio State University. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Thompson to campus because he is a specialist in both international institutions and issues such as global climate change, which he's going to talk about today. Professor Thompson is the author of Channels of Power, the UN Security Council, and U.S. Statecraft in Iraq. He is, and of a series of other articles about the performance of international organizations, the independence of international organizations, and essentially how the international system works now in this sort of bizarre combination of states and international organizations that try to coordinate, and international organizations that have states as members, and international organizations that don't have states as members, and all that kind of thing. So it's really at the cutting edge of the way that the study of international relations is developing. One of the issues that particularly challenges the form of international organization is, well, all environmental issues, but particularly climate change, because this is not something that can be managed at a national level, but it requires changes in behavior at a national level, and we don't really have any way of doing that. It is hard enough to get any particular government to change the behavior of its own people, but somehow getting governments to collaborate on changing behavior across borders is particularly difficult. And of course, all you have to do is live in, say, northeastern Canada to understand that environmental problems do not simply stay within borders as the acid rain falls on you from Ohio, or even things like ducks. You know, the ducks you shoot in Louisiana started out somewhere in Canada, and if they ingested the wrong kind of stuff in Canada, that'll be in the in the ducks you shoot in Louisiana. So.
It's really not an exaggeration to say that the stakes at Copenhagen were the future of the regime. There were two parallel tracks of preparatory work going into the conference. One was trying to come up with a new round of commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol had binding commitments for Annex 1 countries, which refers to the industrialized countries. So Kyoto has binding commitments that require Annex 1 countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by a certain amount. So one goal of Copenhagen and one track of the negotiations was to come up with a second round of commitments, because the first round ends, well, from their perspective, was going to end in 2012. Okay, so that was one of the major goals, post-2012 emissions reduction commitments. The second track of the negotiations was to negotiate either a parallel agreement to Kyoto or a brand new agreement, thinking much more broadly than just emissions reduction commitments. Really, everything was on the table going into Copenhagen. The preparatory work began as early as 2007, so 2 years, and then at Copenhagen itself, you had 2 weeks of negotiations, ending with heads of state coming together for final negotiations to try to get a breakthrough. Here's a picture of Merkel and Sarkozy and Obama and Gordon Brown of the UK on the last night trying to hammer out a deal. So there was a lot of buildup, heads of state showing up at the end, which is fairly unusual. The outcome was a 2-page agreement, well, 2.5 pages if you want to be generous, referred to as the Copenhagen Accord. The Copenhagen Accord basically, in that document, the states that were there decided to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Now this is a collective commitment to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, and collective commitments are fairly meaningless in international law because you can't hold any one state accountable for a collective commitment. The major, or the most important achievement of Copenhagen was an agreement by the rich countries to transfer a lot in a moment. But again, they weren't negotiated multilaterally. They've just been decided on a national basis and submitted subsequently. So, Copenhagen assessments, well, they were generally negative. Greenpeace said on the last night when it was clear that, well, when the Copenhagen Accord was released to the public, Greenpeace said the city of Copenhagen is a crime scene tonight. And the Swedish environment minister, who is representing the EU at the conference, referred to the summit as a disaster and a great failure. But interestingly, for my purposes, a lot of the criticisms focused on the nature of the agreement, not the substantive nature of the agreement, but the fact that it wasn't binding. There were no new binding commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so Gordon Brown, the UK Prime Minister, says, I know what we really need is a legally binding treaty as quickly as possible. He's saying that Copenhagen is not what we need something that's legally binding. The World Wildlife Federation says the Copenhagen Accord is far from the fair, ambitious, and binding deal the world needs. So the bottom line here is that the criticism of Copenhagen was driven partly by the form of the outcome rather than the substance of the outcome. The fact that it did not result in a new hard law treaty. And the implicit and sometimes explicit comparison here was to the Kyoto Protocol, which was the state of the art at the time, which did have binding emissions reduction commitments. So these reactions to Copenhagen reflect what I see as a bias in favor of hard law approaches to global governance problems. According to this view, agreement should contain specific, rigid, and binding obligations, preferably negotiated multilaterally. And I think you saw from some of the quotations on the previous slide that a lot of policymakers and certainly activists prefer these hard law solutions over softer alternatives. And I also think there's a bias among lawyers, both academic lawyers and practicing lawyers. And of course, a lot of the negotiators and policymakers at lower levels of government in this context are lawyers of one sort or another. I think what's